Okay, yeah.
Content over everything.
That was quick.
Yeah, I was just trying to remind myself what the 3 points were.
Right. So when I saw your video with Paul, I kind of saw it as a very kind of like almost a very kind of like reflective video of like how people tend to come with very kind of like a fairly critical views of Islam, and I feel like in particular sometimes when they do that, they do it in a very kind of like what can be seen as a very kind of like offensive position, which I don't think is very productive for building bridges. I don't really think it's productive for getting conversation and dialogue through. Now, when Paul in particular, was it Paul?
Yes, it was Paul.
When Paul in particular obviously was addressing you about the separate books, the separate sects, the separate beliefs, the Hadith studies, which I'm guessing you know about. Yeah, he was asking if you have looked at it on a grand scale spectrum. And now you've done quite a bit of research, but to understand just how broad Islam is, like let's take into perspective the Sunni Muslim. They have what's close to 30,000 hadiths that they have to look at, like academically, and vouch whether or not they are kind of like authentic or not, kind of thing. So my thing, kind of to you in particular, is when you were kind of trying to address Paul, and obviously you kind of took offense to Paul not really wanting to kind of humor that kind of stance point. Why did
I'll
you
explain
take,
what I took offense to, but I'll let you finish.
Yeah, I was going to say, no worries. I was going to say, why would you take offense to that in particular? It's like me having a disagreement about, like, I don't know, the diffusion of oxygen between a permeable wall, right? But I have an education level of Q stage 3 science, right? Which is not any less, but it's still a stepping stone in the grand spectrum of science. So I just wanted to know why you took offense in particular when Paul said, there's a lot of reading that you do have to do. Because one thing, when a lot of Muslims in the park do come here and talk about conversion, and they talk about getting people to take the Shahada and whatever, I don't think they realize just how much study needs to go into a religion like Islam. In particular, when we're talking about, again, they say the Quran is the Holy Scripture, the Holy Book. So that's the word from God. That's the word from God from Muhammad. From God to Muhammad, right? And then the Hadiths, I'm guessing you know what they are.
Yeah.
The scriptures that are seen as accounts during the Prophet's time, and so on and so on. Now you have to understand that there's two sects already, Shia and Sunni. I think you can correct me on this, Shia believe that the people who are more kind of like closer to Muhammad should be the kind of leading people on the kind of like authenticity of these hadiths. But the Sunni believe that there's a bunch of people, right, who were alive during the time of Muhammad, peace be upon him, and have equal testimonies that they want to put forward, and all of these should be assessed academically. Now, when you start from there and realize that this didn't even happen till, I think, 3 generations after Muhammad's death, right? And there is a mountain of research, a kind of plethora of kind of ideologies, beliefs, disagreements, agreements, and so on and so on, that have been going on since, the death of Muhammad. Why do you take offense to Paul when he says that you're coming from a very reductionist standpoint and you need to kind of like have a little bit more of a look before you kind of like assert yourself in the information?
Okay, yeah. So I got a little bit annoyed with Paul towards the end of that video because our discussion was continuing from a previous discussion where I made a specific claim about what the 4 imams who founded the 4 schools of Sunni Islamic law, what views they held on a particular issue. And so at that time, I brought him a specific sort of piece of evidence, which was in this book. It's a book about comparative Sunni Islamic law. And so it compares the established views and well agreed upon views of the 4 schools, and he didn't think that was kind of good enough evidence about what the 4 imams themselves particularly believed, and so he challenged me to.
Can I clear the 4 Sunni imams or Shia imams?
The 4 Sunni imams. Okay. So those are Ibn Malik, Hanifa, Hanbal, who's also sometimes called Ahmad, but Hanbal and Malik. No, I've already said Malik. Shafi. And so I came back with kind of much more direct evidence, which I kind of brought in this book, and I started sort of presenting this evidence for my claim.
Good.
And at that point, kind of, he wasn't sort of familiar with the evidence, so I can understand if he didn't want to have a
go away and
conversation.
study,
Yeah. But it was the fact that instead of simply saying kind of, well, hold on, before I don't feel equipped to have this conversation yet, or like I want to, before we go through this, I want to kind of look through it more myself. It was the fact that he kind of said, he made some like parting shots, like you're being very uneducated about this, or you're not thinking about this very well at all, you're being quite ignorant about this. He said things of that nature, and so I found that kind of pretty irritating. And so to answer the second part of your question, like or address the second part of what you've said, I'm not making a claim about what true Islam should be or what the whole of Islam is. I'm making a specific claim about what these 4 people believed, based on sources that are like reports from their students and some of the earliest, most authentic manuals summarizing their schools of belief. And so I feel I've got like pretty good evidence of what they believed, and so I don't think I'm sort of being simplistic about Sunni Islam. I'm just I'm not claiming like this is what Sunni Islam should be.
You've done a lot more reading than certain Muslims would probably do, to be honest.
So in the comments section, it sounded like you ascribed to me also the that I'm making the insinuation that Muslims are savages. I hope you realize that I'm not doing that.
Fair enough.
Okay, that's good. And one of the other things you did in the comments section was you said that I was taking these sources out of context, and that the context, I think you implied, was of retaliation and defensive warfare, and like the sources I have don't support that interpretation. So maybe you'd want to kind of familiarize yourself with.
Absolutely. I'm very open to definitely having a look into that.
Okay.
Now, when you said that your conversation with Paul was almost a prelude of another conversation,
and
this was only
continuation.
This was a continuation to confirm the information that you presented and Paul hadn't been equipped on. Now, I'll ask you, what was the prelude of that conversation? Because the kind of credentials of 4 imams doesn't just come up in conversation. So what I'm trying to say is, where did the conversation originating or bringing these 4 imams into question come from?
I believe it was because I a few weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now, was standing on a ladder, and I was doing a bit of preaching and shouting, and essentially he thought that I was giving the impression that the righteously guided caliphs and the Salaf were warlike and expansionist and believed in offensive jihad, and he held that wasn't true at all, and that all kind of Islamic conquest during the Rashidun Caliphate was defensive. And so one of the kind of specific bits of evidence against this I brought was the views that the 4 imams held upon the issue of jihad against foreign non-Muslims, and they ruled that it's a fard kifaya, a collective obligation on the community, and that it is to be done until they pay the jizya or convert to Islam. This is all, they all agree on this so far, and what was the other thing? And they also, but like the exception would be if the caliph had declared a truce against that particular group of foreign non-Muslims. But apart from this, like if they don't accept to pay the Muslim state's jizya and they don't accept to convert to Islam, then they are to be made war upon, and that's a collective obligation according to their understanding.
Oh, of course, I understand. And this is where I'm talking about. When we talk about this topic in particular, it's very important that you do research behind it, because even when you say they would put war upon them, right? Just the other day I learned from brother Hamza, or it was Muhammad, one of the two, they're twins, so it's very hard to tell them apart. But he was saying that even within that teaching of inflicting war upon certain people, there have to be certain criteria that are met. And in one, like say, I think it's the people that do leave the religion,
the apostates.
The apostates. That there are 38 conditions that need to be met before they can be put to death. Do you know the 38 conditions?
No.
I don't know the 38 conditions. Now, for me to then assess that a religion or a person or a teaching is kind of like almost not violent in nature, which is not what I'm trying to say, but it's trying to put it across that this is the tactics that they use. It's not completely true, because they would then have to you'd then have to go back and show that within each individual case where they did like inflict all of this, that they did follow the 38 kind of like the 38 conditions that were needed in order to kill someone who was an apostate. Now the problem with that is that it was more of a deterrent. A deterrent not only for the people who are doing the crime, but a deterrent for the people who are enforcing the crimes as well. Because, again, one of the fundamental things of religious teachings in general, or even Islam, is to value life. So, getting rid of life shouldn't be something that's so willy-nilly. Otherwise, it takes away the conviction of that assertion that life is important.
Okay.
So right now, when we're talking about, like I said, the grand spectrum of the whole thing, and I asked you for the prelude, because the prelude is important, we need to understand, like you say, you were here on the thing, and I'm going to ask you about the details of that in a second. You were here on the thing preaching about the imams and their teachings and certain things that did you not necessarily have a problem with, but things that you thought were questionable.
Yeah, I'm happy to say that I have a problem with many of their teachings.
No, absolutely. And when you were kind of presenting them forth, were you presenting them as just general information, or was there an objective to it? Just in the sense that, was it just, these are what the four imams believed, and then you got off the thing, or was there a further explanation and elaboration onto that?
The objective, you could say, is that...
Let me not say objective, because that seems very kind of like you're trying to push something. But let's just say the end goal.
Yeah, I'm happy with either of those terms being used. But the objective or end goal of mentioning what the four imams believed on this issue of kind of jihad against foreign non-Muslims was that if you are a Salafi Muslim, and so you believe that the first 3 generations of Muslims, which are had the ideal and best form of Islam, this is the sort of core belief of Salafi Muslims, and in theory Sunni Muslims believe this as well, but Salafi Muslims place particular purist and important emphasis on this. So if you believe that, then given that these 4 imams were the most prominent scholars of the kind of the Salaf, they're all from the 3rd generation of Muslims, the Tabi'in. So if you believe that they really did have the most ideal form of Islam, then that would mean that you're lending your support towards this warlike sort of ideology. And if you aren't, and if you aren't aware, if you call yourself Salafi, but you aren't aware that the 4 imams held this view, and the righteously guided caliphs followed this behaviour, because that's another important part of being Salafi. You believe that the first 4, the first 4 caliphs were righteously guided. So if you are calling yourself Salaf but you aren't aware of this fact, then I'd invite you to stop calling yourself Salaf, because you're kind of you're declaring support for something which you find objectionable, and which I think any moral person should find objectionable. And so that was the point I was making. I was trying to make an attack on Salafism and show its flaws and moral weaknesses.
Which is not a problem, especially if you've got the information to back that, and it does sound like it's coming from a sound place. The only problem that it suffers from, the whole kind of like the whole, I guess, not module, but the whole kind of point or the stance, what it suffers from is the appeal to authority. It's the idea that just because someone believes in something that they can't question it, or they shouldn't question it. Now, we know this to be wrong because there's a split between Shia and Sunni. And that split originally did come from people disagreeing and agreeing about the practice of Islam. Now, when we talk about, again, the Sunni and the Shia, right, when they split in particular, you can see both sides from a rational point of view. If a monarchy passes away, and I shouldn't even compare the Prophet, peace be upon him, to a monarchy. If I compare a monarchy dying, right, it makes sense that their legacy is then just passed down to the next kind of next of kin, if that makes any sense.
Okay.
But at the same time, you do have a society to look after. So should that wealth necessarily either be passed down, because a lot of the time wealth is taken from the community and passed into the monarchy, right? Should that wealth be given straight away to people who haven't worked and don't deserve it? Or should it then be distributed amongst the people. So when we talk about the Shia and the Sunni split, right, there's a very rational point of view when it comes to both of them, right? It doesn't excuse at all what the violence is created.
I've gotten a little bit lost about how this relates to
Yeah,
me,
I'm coming to it.
Okay.
So what I'm trying to say is, there's, even on that level, there's a split. And almost to that extent, you're almost trying to say that people shouldn't even call themselves Muslims. Because before they were Shia and Sunni, people just called themselves Muslims, right? So if someone saw a disagreement in how, let's say, the Prophet's followers kind of inherited the message, right? Then you're almost asserting that you should not call yourself a Muslim, that you should split off entirely and call yourself something different in regards to your different teachings.
Okay.
Now the problem is, what's happened is that they've kept the name, the Muslim label, but they've then just made subsections of that. So when you talk about, again, being a Salafi, right, and being so, that's a further subsection of different beliefs, because, you know, before we have, let me not do this in a hierarchy, but you have Quranists as well, who just believe in the Quran and not the Hadiths at all. Because I believe as well, in particular, human beings are, what's the word, at risk of eyewitness testimony, which is not accurate a lot of the times. A lot of the times you had some of the hadiths which had minor variants, but then you had some hadiths which are completely different, like contradict to the point of contradiction.
Yes.
So for me, that needs study, that needs interpretation, and that needs a look at.
Okay.
But some people will believe that that doesn't need a study, that doesn't need a look at, because everything that comes from Muhammad is the word of God. Now, where I'm coming from a rational point of view, and someone is coming from, you know, kind of almost a, what's the word? What's the word when you're kind of loyal to someone? What's the word?
Your follower?
Yeah, no, that's not the word I was looking for. It starts with an L. But when someone is a follower of someone and believes in their teaching whole for it, with no rebuke, right? Then that creates a problem, because it separates us in how we believe the certain things, especially if there's hadiths telling me that, in particular, women should dress a certain way, but I look at the Quran and there's nothing about women dressing a certain way, right?
Okay.
But this came from the Prophet Muhammad according to this testimony. But if the Prophet Muhammad, to a lot of Muslims and a lot of Muslim scholars, if the Prophet Muhammad and Allah believed that this was so important, he would have added it into the Quran. This is what a lot of people have problem with, especially people who are Quranists, and they have problems with the hadiths, because humans do use these things to better their political position. Now, what I'm trying to say is, when you say that you should invite people to not call themselves a Salafi,
if
and
they
call themselves a
disagree with
different
the
thing,
Imams and the Rashidun Caliphate on this issue.
Yeah, I absolutely understand, but that's not the module that's been taken throughout history, and that's not the module that necessarily should be taken. It's a matter of labels, and a label is not necessarily the important thing here. The important thing is the message of the religion. So my thing is, why would you draw such a heavy kind of like, what's the word, heavy reliance on labeling yourself a certain thing instead of just living it?
Okay, so I think a couple of, so the first question I'd ask is sort of, would you agree that within some ideologies there are certain core beliefs that if you don't accept or agree with them, then it takes you out of that ideology? So for example, if I said I'm a Muslim but I don't believe Muhammad was a prophet of God, like that, you know, that would take you out of being a Muslim, right?
Yeah.
And so and it's a kind of similar. It's similar to a degree with that, and kind of criticizing the policies of the four righteously guided caliphs, because, for example, I think there's a lot to kind of criticize about what the righteously guided caliphs did, the so-called righteously guided caliphs, and I think it would be good to inform certain
human beings aren't perfect. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to say, but sorry, go on.
So I think it would be good to inform Muslims who call themselves Salafi and say, like, with pride, kind of, I support, you know, the Sahaba, I support what the righteously guided caliphs did. Allah forgave them, and so, you know, who am I to say that they did anything wrong? That sort of like dogmatic view. I'd want to kind of give them this information and say, like, are you really sure you want to kind of put your support behind this? And I think if you do disagree with behaviour like invading, for example, the Christian kingdom of Makuria, which never attacked the Muslim state at all, and then kind of compelling this kingdom to sign a treaty which meant that they had to deliver slaves to the Muslims, 360 per year, in a treaty called the Baht. If you think that's morally condemnable, then maybe I think you should stop calling yourself Salafi, because it's a little bit like like imagine if I started saying kind of, imagine if like kind of there was a group of people who started calling themselves kind of Nazis, but they were told that the Holocaust never happened. This is a bit of an extreme example, but it's the same principle.
The message is there.
Yeah. So if you kind of are brought up and you're told like, Nazis just believed in creating a strong state, and there were these people called Jews, but they were never really kind of persecuted. The Nazis just defended themselves. You should be proud to call yourself a Nazi. And then this group of people kind of started coming around saying, yeah, I'm a proud Nazi. Then, surely it would be good for us to say to them, like, hold on, like, kind of, are you really going to lend your support by calling yourself a Nazi to what these events that actually happened and this kind of bad behavior that's actually happened? I think if you don't agree with like the Holocaust and persecuting people of the Jewish faith, then I think you should stop calling yourself a Nazi. So I think do you see how it's the same kind of principle
absolutely,
involved?
And it's a really good nuanced argument, and I don't think it's extreme in the slightest if you understand the message. I think the problem I draw in particular is that, like you say, instead of rather not calling yourself instead of not calling yourself something, why not call it out? And this is the thing I will say with you. I will agree. When we do talk about these things in particular, there's a lot of people that view these things with a very superstitious nature, and they don't want to question anything. They don't want to like even be seen as a non-believer, even though something has historical context in being asserted for political gain as opposed to religious benefit. So when we talk about religion a lot of the time, right, you always think that religion should spiritually benefit you and not really benefit you in the like material or like, not necessarily like directly, right? It's like say with not drinking or whatever in the Islamic world and so and so. We know that drinking raises certain things of cancer and so and so, right? But back in the day, he wouldn't have had it in mind that let me not tell people to not drink because then they won't get any cancer. We've just found out that's a benefit of it, kind of thing, right? But when we talk about like certain things, like say how women dress, right? You can see that when you draw the parallels between men and women, you can see there's a very kind of like alarming disparage between kind of like how men dress and how women dress. Men can come out here with their tops off because it says from the navel down, and this is according to someone who believes that women aren't attracted to anything that isn't male from anything up. But we know this now from research is wrong, and we know that women, like men, find men in their entirety attractive. So in that sense, should that teaching then not change? But the only problem is that we do have is there's a lot of people who do have a tribalistic nature and don't want to necessarily live the religion per se, but they have a tribalistic nature where they feel comfortable in a community. And addressing that is a good thing because it then allows us to critique religion in a positive stance and not come across as in an offensive position. It comes across as a nuanced position. So after that, we then create bridges, and it's there's not this kind of like fighting back whenever you're like, oh, I saw this and I didn't necessarily agree with his teachings, right? But at the same time, I feel like we suffer from a Western kind of like point of view where we don't believe necessarily that these debates or these discussions are not being had in Islamic communities. There are Muslims calling these things out. There are Muslims reading in. There's a hadith science, for crying out loud. There's people who study these things, compare them to the history and compare them to modern day. And this is ongoing. Where we suffer from a Western point of view is that we're the only ones having the discussion. No, Muslims are having this discussion. And it's kind of arrogant and biased for us as Westerners to look at people from different parts of the world and be like, you know what, we need to civilize them. Kind of
okay. You're not implying that I did that, are you?
No. But okay. This is the thing. We may not want to do that kind of onset. But if you look at the message that we're sending across, right? Did you know that there's people deliberating this within the Muslim community?
Yes, of course.
So then, my question to you is, why would you then assert to them, when they're comfortable calling themselves Salafi and calling out certain things in their religion, why would you then ask them to not call themselves Salafi?
Well, because the ones who are, examining kind of sort of the modern context of Islam and whether kind of Islam as the Salaf practiced it is applicable to the modern world and having quite a historical kind of sensible view of things, they weren't the ones I was addressing that day. So I was addressing the ones who took quite a kind of a sort of a stance where like I said, kind of I'm a Salafi, and I believe that they had the ideal best form of Islam, and the Caliphs were righteously guided. it's not my place to say that they did things wrong and that we can do better. But before we before the conversation gets a bit too broad,
no worries.
I want to sort of bring it back to the original disagreement.
Yeah.
Now that we've discussed a bit,
that's good.
would you be willing to sort of agree that I was not asserting or implying that Muslims have inherently violent nature based on the views of the four imams? Yeah, I wasn't doing that.
The reason I would say I agree.
Okay.
I fully agree, and I fully concede.
Okay, sure.
I don't think that's.
And I'm not asserting that
No,
you're
don't
unreasonable
worry.
for doing that.
Don't worry.
Okay, but can we get so? And then the second point of disagreement was about. Well, I've done it in the wrong order, but like the other point of disagreement was that you thought that I had omitted or misrepresented the views of the four imams, and that these views were actually in a defensive context.
Okay, yeah.
Like, would you concede that? Maybe like
I need to do a bit more reading.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, fair enough.
Absolutely.
And then what was the other one? What was the other one? Oh, and then finally, will you sort of agree that I was not making a claim about Islam in general? I was making a specific claim about a specific thing that I had looked into the evidence quite carefully about. Okay, so I wasn't sort of talking about things that I wasn't.
No, absolutely,
Okay,
absolutely.
cool. Then I think we've
No, absolutely.
We've got to
I do just want to like put this across though, and that's why I came across as more kind of like here's the information I'm going to present to you, and this is how we're going to talk about it. Because I feel like when you kind of put the context first, it allows the person to prepare, so they don't feel kind of like caught off guard. But when we're talking about this thing and you're saying that you didn't necessarily push this idea that you're coming from a superior Western point of view and judging kind of thing, and even from this conversation I can see that. But there has to be a self-awareness and a social justice self-awareness of how it does come across, because that then translates in how people receive you. Because you saw how Paul received you. He didn't want to receive you.
I think a part of that was his ego, though.
Well, this is where I'm gonna correct that. We know the saying, "There goes the neighborhood." Yeah. Now, people will say that often without any kind of like realization where that context comes from. Do you know where "there goes the neighborhood" comes from?
I don't know the origin of that saying.
It will be something that you will say in your general conversation, and not you necessarily.
But I've only heard it on TV. I've never heard someone say it in real life.
That saying actually arose from when African Americans would move into white suburb neighborhoods and wouldn't necessarily cause any trouble, but it would automatically
would
bring
try leaving.
because it would bring the property value down. Not even necessarily because they were racist, just because their property value was going down and they were losing money. So financially and pragmatically, what do? You move and you move up, right? Now people say this very casually now as a saying because they don't understand the context that it's in.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to say is sometimes when you don't understand the context that you're coming from, and you, like Paul is asking, please have a read of the bigger picture, right? He's asking you to understand that sometimes when you do come to him, right, in particular, and talk about like you say, the teachings of the four imams and so on and so, and not calling yourself a Salafi, right? I could then ask, it's a bit of a silly question, but I could then ask, should we abolish the use of the £5 note? Should we? Because right now we have Churchill on the £5 note. Churchill was only 40 to 50 years ago, but we know Churchill labelled Indians as abhorrent people. He said they don't know how to practice sex without producing, they produce like rabbits and so on and so. Now, that's someone who's quite iconic in British culture. Should people then not call themselves British? Or should they just call out what Churchill said while still being proud in their British kind of labeling? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is when you kind of come from that standpoint, right? If I went to any British person saying you shouldn't be using a £5 note, using the £5 note is basically kind of like is basically kind of like pushing this racist agenda. Of course they're going to come back and be like, well, no kind of thing. So this is what I'm trying to say. When we in particular, because I feel like we're on the same wavelength when it comes to addressing certain superstitions and having a little bit more of a nuanced talk about Islam, having a bit more of an academic talk about Islam, and getting people to practice Islam a lot better than the current people who would, like any religion, Sunday Christians, Sunday Jews, they only go, to mass when it's Christmas. They don't follow Christianity, which I would say for a lot of people who claim to be religious. So when we then get into the roots of how you actually practice religion, whether or not you're practicing it and whether or not you're living the life of the Prophet Muhammad, I would assert that I'm living the life of the Prophet Muhammad more than certain people in this park. Because I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't fornicate.
Yeah.
I've been with the same woman for 8 years.
Congratulations.
Like, that is something that is a little bit more closer to home with the Prophet than a lot of people in this park.
Yeah.
But I don't label myself a Muslim necessarily. I'm religious, but I don't label myself a Muslim. But there's a lot of people here who, with their chest, will label themselves as Muslims and they will fight to the death. But when you ask them academically, they don't know much. So what I'm trying to say in particular, if you're going to have these conversations, choose the people that you're going to go to, especially poor, and come with a little bit more of a humble kind of like humble approach to it. Because at the end of the day, you're just trying to get peace. Do you know what I mean, kind of thing? If you're constantly talking about kind of like the criticisms and you're not kind of like, how do I say, you're not kind of like conceding the certain positive aspects that we have gained, then it just comes across as very offensive kind of thing, and that's not productive and that's not conducive.
Okay.
So for me personally, I feel like what you're doing is fine.
Okay.
What you're doing is good.
Okay.
I don't feel like you're extreme, which
Cool.
don't worry about. But I feel like where I have to try and limit my tone when I talk to, say, white people about white supremacy, I can't just go to them and be like, well, Ronald Reagan did this and Ronald Reagan did that. What did you do to basically stop it, right? Why aren't you calling out Ronald Reagan? No, I have to go to them and present that over time. The government has taken away rights and given little rights to certain people to get them on side, kind of thing, right? And right now, white people are on side because they're getting a little bit of the breadcrumbs, and that's left everyone who is a minority elsewhere. And once that paradigm changes, that benefit and that like state of benefit is gonna go. And then what's gonna happen then, kind of thing? You need to have a little bit more of a nuanced approach when you do kind of like talk to people, because right now there's a lot of investment in labeling, there's a lot of investment in community, and there's a lot of investment in kind of like almost gang culture, right? And you need to break that down very slowly. It's not something that you can just whack with a hammer.
Yeah, I agree that like it could be more practical and effective
Absolutely.
for me to have a more reconciliatory or moderated tone. However, with Paul, like, it should have just been, a matter of fact debates, like what did this group of jurists believe? That isn't like kind of a moral question. That isn't a judgmental question. But I just brought it in a very matter of fact way.
Absolutely.
And one other thing is like I'd like to kind of I think your analogy with the Churchill and like kind of someone asking them, well, you're using a £5 note. Kind of do you support Churchill, or like do you support kind of racism against Indians? Like I think it would be I think that analogy doesn't work at the moment. I think in order to make it model the logic of the situation that I was in, we need to change the example to be if there was a group of people who ran a Churchill Appreciation Society and they said as part of their charter, we believe that Winston Churchill was the greatest Briton who ever lived, and that his views and way of leading Britain were the best possible ideal way. Then I think you would kind of, it would be perfectly correct to kind of call them out and say, well, hold on, if are you aware that Churchill did this? Are you really lending your support to that? And so whereas using a £5 note, it isn't sort of endorsing Churchill in that way.
But this is what I'm trying to say about seeing the bigger picture. When we talk about Churchill, who did Churchill serve?
Who did Churchill serve? The British public.
The British establishment. When we use £5 notes and we go to work, we earn wages and whatever, where do our tax dollars go?
The government.
They go to the government. Who the government?
The governments are elected officials.
The British establishment. So when we talk about Churchill, is he denounced or is he celebrated?
He's celebrated, definitely.
By who?
By nearly everyone. Yeah. But like there are voices that say, well, we should criticize them, and I say, good for those voices saying to criticize him.
But it's very few. And to in respect to them, when we're talking about Churchill, most people won't even know about Churchill's quotes, Churchill's saying. There's a lot of things that Churchill did for charity as well that I didn't know about. So he's a very nuanced human being. Like to judge him on that one quote alone would be absolutely ludicrous.
Sure.
Would be ridiculous.
Sure, but we would be able to say, based on this one quote alone, that we can't say he's the ideal and best.
Yeah, he's not the ideal best, but
and that's what these Salafis
but that's what I'm trying to say. Retrospectively, it's really hard when people apply judgment retrospectively. It's hard because you need to remember the times that they lived in, the kind of social norms and social kind of values that they had at the time. So saying stuff like that wasn't necessarily kind of like, there was no repercussions for stuff like that. And whether or not he believed it in his heart, it was maybe just kind of consensus that his political party had and he couldn't do anything about it. The same way as there's certain people in Jeremy Corbyn's party who have anti-Semitic views, but the rest probably don't. But they've all been lump summed into that kind of caliber. So when I talk about like the British establishment and so on, so there is an ongoing problem with our foreign policy, which we don't address. We haven't addressed for 14 to 15 years. You know, people are dying as a result. We are getting terrorism as a result, and people want to blame X, Y, and Z as a result. Which is not saying this is the reason you're looking into Islam, but this is what has prompted a lot of this critical Islamic kind of like magnifying glass. So at the root of even this criticism is a very kind of unfair establishment agenda, which is what I'm trying to talk about. When we look at the broader picture, this kind of critique is very kind of like mundane in comparison to the bigger picture. So when you say that you can't apply the £5 note, I would assert to you absolutely the £5 note is just as significant as the rulings and the legislation that made sure that interracial marriage couldn't exist. And I think when you celebrate someone who did wrong, you are acknowledging and permitting it. And this is what's happening now. You see hate crimes on a rise because we're permitting certain figures. Donald Trump, I don't necessarily think he should visit, but he shouldn't be not allowed to visit. But we're permitting certain figures who will say certain places are shithole countries, even though they're the fastest developing, growing countries, like economically. And you see that this translates from the top to the bottom, right? And we're seeing a lot more fringe right groups, seeing a lot more racism, we're seeing a lot more hate crime. So when we talk about like the £5 note as if like it's a mundane example.
Well, I'd say it's a more indirect example.
Yeah, of course.
Much more indirect
than
saying, I believe that this person has the ideal way of running things.
Absolutely.
Okay. But I think kind of we sort of, maybe this is like a fairly good place to,
debate? Absolutely. But generally, like, I don't mind critique as long as it's coming from a healthy place, and again, like academic place, because academia can be proven wrong and it can be proven right. Opinions can't. People can change their opinions every day, and they can't give up on their opinions. So I like the way you're doing it, but I would say just maybe change your approach. And maybe just look at a bigger picture as well to kind of like see that, especially when it comes to Islam, because there's a lot of cultural ties that don't necessarily translate into the religion. And a lot of people are holding cultural ties to the religion, right? And they're very kind of what's the word? They have a sentimentality to their culture, as everyone does, kind of thing. So it's kind of like just that kind of respect first. Whether or not you disagree or not, it's just that respect, and then it's building bridges from there.
I agree, that would be effective.
Other than that, I definitely love that you're going.
Yeah. What's your real name? No, apart from Black Tie guy.
Rajiv.
My name's Jamie.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you.
Yeah. So definitely, definitely carry on.
Yeah. Thanks for the conversation.
Come take over everything from your humanity.
Man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV. Listen. Rolling. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. توكلت على الله رب العالمين. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. First of all, I wanted to say these strong words.